was talking with Edo Roshi, and we have been sort of discussing exploring what we are calling mitigating zombie mind. And so I was sort of tasked with kind of sensitizing that future exploration to you this evening. My intention is just sort of sensitize this in such a way that intrigues you to think about it throughout the week. And so when Edo Roshi is back next week, we can kind of, I think, address this in what we hope to be sort of engaged and collective way. So I thought this would be a really easy thing to talk about, actually. And then I sat down this evening, for meditation, and it struck me just how complex and difficult this really is. And I guess that sense of surprise is, I think, very interesting and I think worth exploring. Because when I think about mitigating zombie mind, what does that mean? I think this idea should be explored in many different ways, in many different contexts. But I think ultimately it's bringing this mind of meditation into our life, into a fuller way. And I think there's that saying in Zen that the longer you practice, the more your whole life becomes like meditation. And it's actually so natural that you don't even have to worry about it or try. But meditation sort of permeates throughout our lives. It is not confined to this room. And I think that was the thing that surprised me as I sort of looked in myself for kind of like answers to this question, or how would even approach such an exploration. And what struck me is that I think my normal mode of thinking is I can control my life. I can make it better. I can be more efficient. And this is exactly why I need a meditative practice. This is why I come to Zen. Because that meditative mind is not something that we can control. It's the thing that actually kind of can let go of that and have some sense of peace and a deeper sense of understanding and knowing that is embodied. It just it doesn't need an answer because it just is your life. And when I come to meditation, I remember this. And this is why I need it, because I forget. And I think that that's a big part of zombie mind, is the fact that if we're not careful, we can forget so much of what's so important for so much of our lives. And I think this is sort of the great task that we are given in Zen, is to not waste time. But when I think about the complexity of this, then, it's sort of like I'm trying to bring my meditative mind to a greater degree into my life. And I know that the meditative mind is the thing that I can't control. It just sort of permeates when I allow a situation to exist that cultivates it. I think that's, from the ego point of view, or from a conceptual point of view, maybe that's the best that we do with meditative mind, or this absolute mind. It's not that we know exactly where to find it and we just go in that direction. I think it's more like we just allow ourselves to open to a richness that our habitual way of thinking can keep us from seeing. And so this idea of looking into zombie mind and how we spend our time, and maybe what would good leisure be, I think that's a great way of framing it too. I think in our modern lives, we do much in a day that is very exhausting. Just the sheer amount of information that isn't even local to us, but about the world and about dire conditions that are going on in our country, abroad. We have all of this information. Many of us work hard, maybe even tedious jobs at times. And then we come to the time that we think is just for our leisure, for our enjoyment. And I think that culturally, we are falling into like very passive ways of engaging ourselves in leisure. And so this exploration into zombie mind is sort of like asking the question, is what you're doing really making you happy? Like, are you really deriving pleasure from it? Or are you doing it because it's easy and that you're just sort of used to doing it? I think the zombie mind has a lot to do with what keeps us from being spontaneous. It's like we just sort of get in, or I know that I do, I get into a pattern. And at some point it just becomes like the pattern of my day. You know, if it's a school day, I wake up, I do X, I do Y, I get my work done. Which is great. I think it's an efficient way of being a student. But when I do that throughout the whole course of my day, when I'm tired and I just sort of do the thing that I'm used to doing when I'm tired, I think it kind of becomes a problem for me. Or when I no longer sort of engage my media. Maybe I watch something because it's just there. I think that's a lot to me of sort of the danger of having things like Netflix or Amazon Prime, where you have almost this sort of infinite array of things that you don't really care that much about. I sort of really prefer the days where I would just seek out whatever film I wanted or whatever show, and I pursued something specific out of my genuine curiosity and something in me that sought some greater understanding of myself or the world and my place in it, but really engaging ourselves that way. I think for me it's sort of obvious when I think about what I read, because reading is so, I think, culturally kind of uplifted in the sense that reading is more about information and kind of like learning about life and enriching ourselves. But I don't know how many people really think of television that way. I think it has more to do with entertainment. I learned this idea, it was from a thinker, Neil Postman, who was very endearing to me. He wrote a lot about culture and education, modern times. But he pointed out this idea that, to his understanding, the Greek word for education and the Greek word for literature were actually the same. That in Greek society, that to have free time, to have leisure, it was just assumed that you would cultivate yourself. And I think even when I look into myself, like that seems strange to me. Because I think the culture that I inherited doesn't look at those as the same thing. To cultivate yourself is kind of like to be skills-based or in this self-improvement, probably racket, you know? Which isn't really a great way of living either. We need to relax. We need to unwind. But when those two become so removed from one another, I think it's problematic. And I think like engaging this zombie mind is sort of like trying to bring those two things closer together, where we engage ourselves in a rich and spontaneous way in our most leisurely and enjoyable and relaxing moments. I think it's like this dual nature of we actually have to get ourselves into our car and drive a certain distance at a specific time to reach this place, to then sit in such a way where we can experience our mind in a more intimate and nuanced way. It's that kind of symbiotic relationship, I think, by like calculation of getting here and making practice happening in your life, and then once you find that, to let go. And I think a lot of our lives can be like that. I think our leisure can be like that. And I would like to sort of explore that as a Zen community, because so much of our training as Zen students happens outside of this place. I think that's sort of obvious. As Zen students, we learn from life itself, our lives. And we are not monastics. I am sitting here wearing a kesa, but my life in a lot of ways resembles a lay practitioner's life. I do not live the life of a monastic. These are very real and pertinent issues for me, and I think almost anyone that I know of that does something like a Zen practice in this country. So I think tapping that into our practice and rooting it there could be of great utility to us. Maybe you have some questions. Well, I have a question. Does mitigating zombie mind make sense as a concept? Do you know what I'm talking about when I say that?
I'd like more clarification on what you mean by zombie mind.
I think it's like, I suspect that there's quite a bit of vegging out going on in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I mean with zombie mind.
Just automatic pilot.
Yes, automatic pilot, default mode.
So, zombie mind is the uncritical mind, the mind that just, I guess default, when you said default, that, but what are we defaulting to? Is it what the culture presents to us? What we're spoon-fed every day?
That might be, maybe I hope to be outside the parameter of what we're doing. Because whether it's right or wrong is not the point. I think the point is whether or not you choose to engage your life. Like, that's the thing you can control. Whether or not it's culturally appropriate is for you to determine. That's outside of the parameters of Zen practice even, I think. But whether you engage it is the practice. And engaging leisure, like what will you do when you go home this evening, is, I think, as important as what you did when you were here as a Zen student. And it's, I think, maybe another way of framing it, I mean, this is Dogen Zenji's teachings. This is so much of Ryokan's teachings. But if we just fixate on the enlightenment bit, we start to kind of glom onto it in a way that makes it delusory. But when we engage our delusion mind, we, like, that is itself awakening when we engage it and we see it as such. But just exploring this notion of kind of opening our practice up and to give it more of a sense of it being in the home, in the work, in how we choose to spend our time, is this idea of zombie mind. Because I think choice is variable. And that's sort of like whether you're conscious or not. It's sort of like, are you really choosing to do the thing that you're doing? Or are you vegging out and being in default autopilot? It's that question. Does it seem an important question? Does it seem... Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the only one who experiences autopilot in like various moments of my day. maybe the joke is on me.
No. I mean, I can totally relate to, you mentioned habitual patterns that you fall into.
Mhm.
It's like, I mean, particularly when I was working, I mean, I didn't really have to think. I mean, there were times I got to work and I don't remember driving there. I just automatically get off, and there have been times when I get on the highway and I miss my exit because it's like I was going someplace else instead of where I was supposed to be going. So I can totally relate. That pattern living has been disrupted somewhat since I retired, because now it's like, oh my, I do have some time to decide what do I want to do right now. So yeah. I guess going back to I'm not sure how to put this. A couple of years ago, I went back to St. Louis for a 50-year reunion, grade school. And one of the people I was talking to just looked at me and said, well, what do you like to do for fun? And I really was stopped in my tracks, because the things that I thought for fun, it's like I enjoy gardening, I enjoy yard work, but it's like, well, then I'm thinking, well, is that work or is, anyway, it was confusing. It wasn't like, oh, I like to go bowling, I like to go fishing, I like to do this, the usual, go to concerts, go to this, go to that. It's like I started thinking, well, what do I do for fun? And what comes to mind is, what is the saying? Carry water and chop wood. And it's like, well, that seems to be my lifestyle. I wake up in the morning and, usually I'll fix coffee, decide what needs to be done around the house, what's happening in the yard, do I need to pick tomatoes today? I mean, it's like, I don't know if that's, I guess I'm not clear on zombie mind. I somehow associate it with just unconsciously going through the motions of life.
You brought up two things that I think are important. Because this sense of driving without being present, that's not always bad. Because you don't want to just be on all the time, because driving is actually a thing that we're usually pretty good at, and we don't have to be sort of in our executive functioning to do.
Right.
Which is sort of what mastery is, which is kind of what allows flow to happen, which is, I think, a very integral part of the creative process. But that's, I think, maybe I would like to frame it this way. Because I have been told that thing about how meditation permeates your life the longer you sit. And I think I've always sort of believed that, but I've never really known it to be true. And I see how my meditative mind is breaking out into my student life and my friendships. And I don't think it's flow per se, but it's sort of close to that. It's like this mind where I'm not engaging it in a calculated way.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what it is. But it's like I've allowed the condition in my life to exist for that to happen. Like I've engaged in art, or I've found something that was really inspirational to me. Or I had that conversation with a friend where I really just sat and listened. And I wasn't reflexive, but we went into some topic deeply. I think it's like I think cultivating our life in such a way that this mind is more likely, which isn't about control per se.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about inspiration and having a gratitude and a zest for being alive. Like, that's the opposite of zombie mind. It's not engagement per se, it's like respect for life. For life. I think we've talked quite a bit. I don't know if yeah, burning question.
Not burning.
Not burning.
Yeah, not
but-
burning. Are you talking, is it, what you're talking, is the opposite of zombie mind being more mindful in what you wander around during the day?
Did we come there that fast? I don't know. I didn't think of that, honestly, Del. It's like looking around the things around mindfulness. I think, like, if anything happens from this talk this evening, I hope it's sort of to kind of convince you to look at this in your life. Like, when are you mindful or when are you not? Like, what does that hinge on? Because I think we all have those moments too where life is just sort of happening. And it's like, nah. And like understanding where that's coming from. Or when you're truly engaged in like being your full enthusiastic self. Like, it's like engaging that. It's sort of the idea, I think, as I understand it. Yes, Donna?
It's probably because I wear hearing aids, but I want to make sure I understand the terms you're using. Is it mitigating?
Mitigating.
Mitigating what in mind?
Zombie. It's like zombie, like The Waking Dead.
Zombie.
It's not like maybe what other people would call it, but it's what we playfully came up with. We can change the name later. If we I'm not, sold on it, I guess. No, but that is, really, I would just wanted this to be less about figuring it out, the more opening up the question. So I think that would be, I think the most prudent thing is just to end on that sentiment that how conscious are we of how we spend our time? Do we like all the things that we do? Are there things that we do that we don't really even like doing? We just do them out of habit. That, I think, is good for us to explore.